Have you ever looked into someone's eyes and felt like your entire life had finally found its meaning, only to later realize that those same eyes held the power to destroy you? You didn't fall in love with a person. You fell in love with a promise, a reflection, a fantasy stitched together by your own longing. And when that fantasy began to crumble, you didn't walk away. You held on tighter, because leaving would mean more than losing them. It would mean admitting to yourself that everything you believed about love, about hope, about healing, was built on a lie. It's not that you didn't know. Deep down you did. You felt the dread, the anxiety, the cold silences between the warmth. You noticed how your light began to dim, how you shrank, your joy filtered your truth, bent your needs into shapes small enough to fit inside someone else's comfort zone. But you kept going, because they weren't always like this. Because in the beginning, they made you feel like you were the answer to a question they never knew how to ask. Because they saw you, really saw you, or so you thought. And in a world that rarely does, that moment of being seen became your oxygen. But love that requires you to suffocate yourself is not love. It's captivity. It's a beautiful prison with velvet walls. And every time you thought about escaping the memory of their warmth, whispered, maybe it's you. Maybe you're asking for too much. Maybe if you were calmer, more understanding, more forgiving, they'd return to who they were. But that version of them, it was never real. It was a mask built to lure you in. And once it slipped, the one who emerged didn't love you. They needed to control you. And the most effective way to control someone isn't through cruelty. It's through inconsistency. Give them just enough to stay addicted, just enough to hope, just enough to make pain feel like a challenge instead of a warning. You see, what you're feeling isn't just heartbreak, it's withdrawal, that pit in your stomach. That's your nervous system craving the next dose of unpredictable affection. That's your trauma screaming in a language it learned long before this relationship ever began. Because the truth is, you didn't just fall in love with them. You fell in love with a pattern. And that pattern was built long ago in childhood homes, where love meant walking on eggshells, where tenderness came with strings attached, where silence meant punishment, and affection had to be earned. So, when this person came along hot and cold, affectionate and aloof, loving and distant, your nervous system didn't panic. It recognized the terrain. It said, ah, this feels familiar. This must be love. And without realizing it, you became a child again, trying to win approval, trying to avoid punishment, trying to decode the rules of someone else's brokenness, hoping that if you just played the game right, you'd finally be enough. That's why it's so hard to leave, not because you're weak, but because you're wired. Wired to associate chaos with passion, conditioned to confuse anxiety with excitement, trained to believe that love should feel like chasing something just out of reach. So you stay not because you don't see the red flags, but because the red feels like home. This is what makes trauma bonds so devastating. They don't shackle you with force. They seduce you with nostalgia, and they wear the mask of destiny. You don't realize you're drowning because the water feels like the same ocean you were born in. But make no mistake, just because something feels familiar doesn't mean it's safe. In fact, the most dangerous love is the one that mirrors your childhood wounds and calls itself fate. And let's talk about that word fate. What if I told you that the idea of meant to be is the most seductive lie you've ever believed? That it was never the universe bringing you two together. It was your subconscious, recreating a script it's been trying to rewrite for decades. That every fight, every cold shoulder, every tear you swallowed was part of an ancient ritual to make the past finally feel different, that you were never trying to heal this relationship. You were trying to heal yourself through it. But people are not therapists. Lovers are not parents. And you cannot heal a wound by reopening it over and over again, hoping that this time the pain will finally end in a kiss. So, what happens next? You start to lose yourself. Slowly at first, you stop laughing as much. You stop sharing your thoughts. You start choosing silence over conflict because explaining your pain became exhausting. And then, the apologies come not from them, but from you. You apologize for being emotional, for asking for clarity, for needing something as basic as respect. You apologize for your tone, for your timing of your tone, for existing in a way that makes someone else uncomfortable. You begin to distrust your own instincts. You replay conversations in your head at night, not because you want to, but because you need to know if you're losing your mind. You think maybe you exaggerated. Maybe they were right. Maybe you are too sensitive. You start to ask less and expect even less. And still they find ways to make you feel like you're taking too much. That's how they trap you, not with fists, but with guilt. Not with chains, but with doubt. They don't need to control your actions if they've already colonized your thoughts. This is gaslighting at its most refined. Not the overt screaming matches or dramatic denials, but the subtle unraveling of your reality. The you always do this, and you're imagining things, and you're just insecure. They say these things so casually, with such conviction, that you start to wonder if maybe they're right. And when someone makes you doubt your memory, your judgment, your sanity, they own you. Not your body, your mind. And once they own your mind, the rest follows. Your boundaries collapse. Your identity fragments, your confidence evaporates, and all that's left is someone who looks like you, talks like you, but no longer knows how to say no, no longer remembers what joy felt like, no longer believes in their own worth. But even then you stay. Because your greatest fear isn't being hurt, it's being alone. Because somewhere deep inside, you were taught that solitude equals failure. That being chosen is proof of value, that the absence of a partner is the presence of inadequacy. So you tolerate the pain because the alternative feels worse. And here's the cruel irony, this person knows that. Whether consciously or unconsciously, they exploit your fear of abandonment. They don't need to lock the door to keep you inside. They just need to convince you that the world outside is colder than their inconsistency. And so you settle, you shrink, you survive. But surviving is not living. And the longer you endure, the more you forget what living even feels like. But one day, maybe in the silence, after another fight, or in the stillness when they leave the room, you hear something deeper than fear. You hear the whisper of your own exhaustion, a tiny voice that says, "This isn't love. This is survival in disguise." And suddenly, that whisper becomes louder than their excuses, louder than your fantasies, louder than the hope you've been feeding like a dying flame. You start to remember what it felt like to not be afraid, not to perform, not to explain your emotions like courtroom evidence. You start to remember yourself, not in full, but in flickers. And those flickers, that's your soul begging to come back. But here's the twist. Even when you realize the truth, leaving doesn't get easier. In fact, it gets harder. Because now you're battling not just the illusion of love, but the identity you've wrapped around it. You built your self-worth around their approval. You spent years teaching your nervous system that their attention equals safety. So the moment you try to leave, your brain, goes into panic. Withdrawal. You're not just missing them. You're detoxing from the chemicals your body produced in response to their unpredictability. The dopamine rush of reconciliation, the cortisol of their anger, the oxytocin of makeup sex. Your entire biology became part of the bond. And like any drug, the absence of it feels like death. This is why you justify. This is why you excuse. This is why you say, it's not always bad. Because you're trying to bargain with the pain. You're trying to find a version of the story where you get to stay and heal at the same time. But no such version exists, because the very presence of this relationship is the reopening of the wound. You cannot heal inside the fire that keeps burning you. You cannot grow roots in soil that was poisoned from the start. And so, you stand at the edge, one hand still holding the past, the other trembling toward a future you cannot see. You know what you need to do. But knowledge is not enough. You need action. You need courage. And most of all, you need to surrender the fantasy. Because no healing can begin until you accept this one brutal truth. They are not going to change. Not for you. Not for anyone. Because the version of them you're clinging to, the kind one, the gentle one, the one who made you feel special, that version was a performance, a mask, a sales pitch, and you bought it. We all have. But now you know better. So what happens when you finally decide to walk away? First, the grief. Not just of losing them, but of losing the version of yourself who believed in the illusion. You will mourn the time you wasted, the energy you gave, the tears you spilled. You will feel anger, regret, betrayal. And that's normal. That's the price of awakening. But then comes the real storm, the withdrawal. Because even toxic love feels like love when you're addicted. You will crave their voice. You will check your phone reflexively. You will wonder what they're doing, who they're with, if they're missing you. And your brain will lie to you. It will show you only the good memories. It will silence the nights you cried yourself to sleep, the gaslighting, the manipulation, the fear. That's your biology trying to get its fix. Don't fall for it. When the cravings hit, anchor yourself in reality. Make a list, a brutal, unfiltered list of every time they hurt you, every time you felt unseen, unloved, disrespected. Read it when your heart lies to you. Read it when your memory betrays you. Read it when their name starts to feel like a ghost tapping at your window. And don't contact them. Not for closure. Not for one last talk. Not to explain yourself. Because closure is not something they can give you. If they were capable of giving you peace, you wouldn't be broken in the first place. The closure you seek is really just one last hit of the drug. One last chance to convince yourself that maybe it wasn't all for nothing, but it was. And that's okay. Because even nothing teaches you something. What you do now, in this space between destruction and rebirth, is what determines who you become. You rebuild. Slowly. Painfully. But honestly. You surround yourself with people who don't make you prove your worth. You fill your time with things that nourish, not drain. You learn to sit in silence without fearing it. You learn to hear your own voice again, shaky, unsure, but real. And over time, that voice becomes stronger, clearer, louder. It tells you what you like, what you want, what you will never tolerate again. It draws boundaries not out of fear, but out of respect. It reminds you that love doesn't demand sacrifice of self, that peace is not boring, that calm is not absence, it's presence. The kind of presence that lets you breathe without apology. And then one day you wake up and realize it's quiet. Not the silence of being ignored, but the stillness of not being afraid. You don't miss them. You don't hate them. you feel nothing, and that nothing that's freedom. Because indifference is the final stage of healing, not rage, not revenge, not forgiveness, just indifference. The knowledge that they no longer live inside your head, that your nervous system no longer flinches at their name, that you have reclaimed your life, not by erasing the past, but by refusing to let it define your future. You are not who you were when this began. You are wiser, sharper, softer in the right places, stronger in others. You don't need to become hard to protect yourself. You need to become whole. And wholeness isn't perfection. It's integration. It's looking at every broken piece of yourself and saying, I still choose me. Because at the end of all this, you don't owe anyone a perfect story. You don't owe explanations to those who never cared to listen. You owe only one thing, to the younger version of you who begged for love, to never abandon yourself again. And that begins now. But healing doesn't just mean surviving the silence. It means learning how to live again, without the noise. Because once the chaos is gone, once the cycle is broken, you're left with something more terrifying than heartbreak space. And in that space, you meet someone you've ignored for years yourself. Not the version they shaped, not the mask you wore to keep the peace, but the raw, unfiltered self you abandoned to stay loved. And that reunion, it's not always gentle. Because when you finally hear your own voice again, it might be crying. You will feel the weight of everything you silenced: your needs, your anger, your sadness, your truth. You'll remember the nights you said, I'm fine, when you were breaking. You'll feel the tremble in your chest that you ignored to keep the relationship intact. You'll grieve not just the person who hurt you, but the parts of yourself you betrayed to keep them comfortable. And that grief, it's sacred. Let it wash over you. Let it show you where the wounds live. Because only in feeling it fully can you begin to reclaim what was lost. This is the part no one talks about. The part after you leave. The part where the world tells you to move on, but you still wake up with their voice in your dreams. The part where friends say, you're so strong, but you feel anything but. The part where your body is free, but your soul still flinches when you hear a familiar ringtone. Healing isn't linear. It's not a checklist. It's not a series of mantras or a calendar of milestones. It's messy. It's brutal. It's beautiful. And it's worth every moment. Because with every tear you let fall without shame, with every memory you face, without running, with every truth you speak, without apology, you reclaim power. Not power over them, but over yourself. And that's the only power that ever mattered. Because when you stop needing someone else to love you in order to feel worthy, you become unstoppable. When you stop begging to be chosen, you realize you were never meant to be a second option in your own life. And when you stop fearing loneliness, you discover something radical. Solitude is not emptiness. It's freedom. You begin to see love differently. It no longer looks like adrenaline and anxiety. It no longer wears the mask of highs and lows. It doesn't demand your silence to survive. Real love feels boring at first because it's safe. It doesn't trigger your survival instincts. It doesn't need fixing or chasing. It doesn't whisper threats underneath compliments. It holds space. It listens. It respects. And most importantly, it allows you to stay whole. But to accept that love, you must become someone who believes they deserve it. Not the version of you who tolerated emotional scraps. Not the version who confused pain with passion. But the version who no longer sees their worth as something negotiable. That version is born when you stop trying to prove your value and start protecting it. And protection doesn't mean walls. It means clarity. You become clear on what you will no longer accept. You become clear on what red flags mean. You become clear on what your body is telling you. No more overriding your gut because they said you're too sensitive. No more shrinking your needs because they called them too much. No more rewriting your truth to fit into someone else's fiction. You no longer seek love that demands your disappearance. Instead, you choose presence. You choose people who meet you in your fullness, who don't flinch when you speak your needs, who don't punish your vulnerability, who don't make you earn every ounce of affection like currency. You choose the kind of love that feels like breath, not suffocation. The kind that brings you back to yourself, not further away. But even then, be prepared. Because once you begin to radiate that self-worth, some people will try to return. Not because they've changed, but because they sense the shift. The energy they once fed on is no longer available, and they will come back, not to love you, but to test you, to see if you still belong to them, to see if your no is really a no. And in that moment, you'll feel the pull, the temptation to reopen the door, not out of love, but out of nostalgia, out of fear, out of the echo of who you used to be. But don't. Don't reopen what almost destroyed you just because you're lonely. Don't confuse hunger with desire. Don't mistake a craving for a calling. Because the person you're becoming, the one who survived the storm, is not compatible with the chaos you left behind. You are not who you were, and they don't deserve the version of you that cost so much to rebuild. Instead, bless the lesson. Thank the pain. Not because it was okay, but because it woke you up. Because it taught you how to recognize what you will never allow again. Because it carved space for the kind of love that begins within. That kind of love. It's quiet. It doesn't scream for attention. It doesn't beg for validation. It simply exists, steady, certain, whole. And from that wholeness, everything changes. You no longer attract people who feed on your wounds. You no longer mistake emotional chaos for chemistry. You don't settle. You don't chase. You don't perform. You simply are. And that is enough. That has always been enough. And maybe one day you'll meet someone. Not a savior. Not a fixer. Just someone who sees you as you are and doesn't flinch. Someone who meets you in the middle without games or masks. And when that happens, you won't be afraid. You won't sabotage it. You won't shrink in fear of loss. Because you'll know that losing someone is never as bad as losing yourself. And even if that person never comes, you're still free. Because you're no longer waiting to be loved to feel lovable. You're no longer measuring your worth by someone else's ability to see it. You are no longer at war with yourself for the sake of peace with someone else. You have come home to yourself. And now comes the final truth. Not the truth about them. Not about what they did or what they failed to do, but the truth about you. The truth that has always been waiting beneath the rubble of your broken expectations, your abandoned needs, your silenced voice. The truth that love was never supposed to be this confusing, that affection was never meant to leave you in pieces, that being in someone's arms was not supposed to feel like standing on a battlefield, waiting for the next emotional landmine to explode. You see it now, don't you? That what you call love was just survival. That what you thought was connection was a reenactment of your oldest wounds. That what kept you going wasn't devotion. It was the hope that maybe this time, pain would finally give birth to meaning. But it never did. Because pain only transforms when you stop protecting it. When you stop wrapping it in excuses and start calling it what it is, a message. A message from your past. A message that says you deserve better. Not because you're perfect, but because you are human. And humanity does not have to be earned. It only needs to be honored. So now here you are, standing on the other side. Not healed maybe, not whole yet, but aware, awake. And that awareness, that is your superpower. That is your shield. Because once you see the pattern, you can break it. Once you name the wound, you can stop bleeding. Once you hear your voice, you can follow it out of the fire. And yes, the fire will try to follow you. It will whisper that you're still not enough, that you'll always be too hard to love, that maybe they were right. But here's the thing, they don't get to be right anymore. Not in your story, not in your mind, not in your body. Because the person you are becoming is not interested in survival. She's interested in truth, in joy, in peace that doesn't need to be bought with your silence. This is your turning point, the moment where you stop chasing what broke you and start building what will hold you. The moment where you stop explaining your worth and start embodying it. The moment you stop seeking love as a form of rescue and start living as if you were already free. Because you are. You are free to walk away without a dramatic goodbye. Free to grieve without guilt. Free to say this is not enough without apology. Free to choose yourself again and again and again, until choosing yourself is no longer an act of rebellion, but a habit of reverence. So take a breath. Not the shallow kind you used to take when you were trying not to upset them. A deep one. One that fills your lungs with oxygen and your heart with clarity. One that reminds your body that it no longer has to live in fear. One that says, I am here. I exist. And I belong to no one but myself. And now, if you've made it this far, if any part of this truth has echoed inside you, then I ask you to do just one thing. Not for me, not for them, but for you. Look in the mirror tonight. Really look. Not at your flaws, not at your history, not at the pain behind your eyes. Look at your presence, at your resilience, at the fact that even after everything you are still here, still breathing, still hoping, still worthy. And then say this not to convince yourself, but to remind yourself, I will never again abandon myself for the sake of being loved. I will never again confuse chaos with chemistry. I will never again stay silent to keep someone else comfortable. I will never again sacrifice my peace for a promise that was never real. Because I am not the brokenness they gave me. I am the fire I walked through. And now, finally, I choose me. So, if this story touched something in you, don't just watch in silence. Speak, share, comment. Not because algorithms matter, but because someone somewhere is still trapped in the very hell you escaped. Let them know they are not alone, that the path out exists, that we don't heal in isolation, we heal in witness. And if this is your moment, if today is the day you take your first breath outside the cage, then hold on. Because the life waiting for you, beyond this pain, is more beautiful than you've ever known. You don't need to become someone else to be loved. You just need to return to the one you've always been. And that is your freedom. Now take it.